This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Pittsburgh to Scranton, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Today we are on location shooting in Potter County in the county seat, Coudersport. We are here to visit the Eliot Ness Museum and to examine the role of Eliot Ness in law enforcement and in Pennsylvania. Let's meet the museum founder and director, Steve Green.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi,
Come on.
Steve.
How you doing? Come on
right.
to see the museum.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
excited you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
Not damn packed. Well, it's good to see you back here.
We're inside the Eliot Ness Museum here in Coudersport with the museum's founder and director, Steve Green. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charlie. Nice to see you.
So nice to have you on Behind the Headlines.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, you're quite welcome. It's our pleasure. We want to ask you a little bit, Steve, where were you from originally before you ended up here at the museum in Coudersport?
Well, I was born and raised in a little rural area north of Pittsburgh. But my family and I found the place where I live now in Potter County as a family retreat back in the 60s. And that's where I live now. And that's what brought us to Potter County in the first place.
What kind of work did you do prior to becoming the founder and the president, CEO of this museum?
I went to school for environmental management at Penn State and worked my entire career in environmental management, environmental science for industry. Steel industry, for Westinghouse, managing the oversight and cleanup of much of the nuclear weapons complex. Retired, then worked again in the steel industry, and then retired early here to come here and take care of my mother for the last decade or so, and which is where I always wanted to end up. We live in the wilderness, and during the course of that time, we decided to have an Eliot Ness Fest in 2018. My brother and I, we grew up with the TV show, and I'm going to tell you right now, Robert Stack is Eliot Ness to me.
The TV show, The Untouchables.
The TV show, The Untouchables, correct. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about Coudersport, but that show influenced my brother and I a lot, and we like old cars. So that's what got us involved in that festival, which ultimately led to me starting the museum here when I needed a new place to store the cars we brought here for that festival. We put them in the windows. This building had been a dead storefront for 6 years. We put the vehicles in the windows to dress up the sidewalk, and then got carried away and made a museum. So that's kind of it.
How did you do it? Because this is probably the largest collection of Eliot Ness memorabilia, and one of the best museums dedicated to criminal enforcement I know of in America. How did you go about putting this together?
Thank you for that, because we do celebrate law enforcement, and you're absolutely right. There's no other Eliot Ness museum. But to launch the museum, this is two buildings, 1880 and 1881. The building we're sitting in right now was actually a Ford dealer in the 1920s, 1930s. Now I'm getting into the group weeds a little bit here, but that's what enabled us to bring the cars and trucks in here. And as I said, starting with that, we thought, well, why don't we make a museum? And with a lot of help from a lot of folks who have contributed things to our exhibits, a lot of acquisitions, partnering with some real Ness experts around the country. A. Brad Schwartz, who I mentioned to you, my dear friend Paul Heimel, author of 3 Ness books, who's a local friend here in Coudersport. Scott Sroka, who is the actual descendant of Ness's driver, Joe Leeson, is also a partner. They're all partners in this museum, as is ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which is today's federal agency that the Treasury Department Bureau of Prohibition ultimately morphed into. So Eliot Ness is ATF's legacy. So you're going to see a lot of things in here on ATF. In fact, right here is what I call our Great Wall of ATF. We also have some really important artifacts that ATF has put on long-term loan here in the museum, including an actual speakeasy bar that was confiscated by the Treasury Department, Bureau of Prohibition, back during Prohibition. Over the course of the years, it's a community museum. The community has gotten more involved. A lot of folks have donated items for the museum. It's sort of eclectic. We cover Ness's whole life, so you're going to see things in here from the early 1900s through the late 1950s.
Well, that goes into my question of when you and your brother, when you decided to make this a museum dedicated to Eliot Ness, what was the reception that you had from the Coudersport community, from Potter County?
The reception's always been good. The community has always very much supported it. One of the things we've been able to accomplish, though, is really help the community learn about why Coudersport for the Eliot Ness Museum. Because folks didn't really have a good handle on that necessarily, but the community's been very receptive. My vision, in part, for this museum, in large part actually, was to help make Coudersport a destination. And one of the things I emphasize why Coudersport, why this museum is in Coudersport, the bottom line is that while Ness came here in 1956, after his accomplishments in Chicago and Cleveland, and a host of other things he did throughout his life, all of which you'll find in here. But he came here in 1956, then now with his third wife, Elizabeth, their adopted son, Robert, to launch a business that ultimately failed, but it was a business to watermark documents, so they couldn't be forged, legal documents, stocks, bonds, checks, things like that. His first office was actually upstairs in this building, in what we cleverly call now the Eliot Ness Suite, an apartment upstairs. He and Elizabeth and Robert lived across this square beyond the courthouse. And he was only here about 12 months. And this company was failing. He died in May of '57, which I'll get to in a minute, but that's only like 12 months. This company was failing.
But the company only failed after
ultimately,
his death.
True. Ultimately, right. But it was beginning to fail.
They were having problems.
Ness was having trouble paying the bills, trying to recover losses of his investors, many of whom were local friends he had made, because he's such an honest guy, you can imagine. So he's stressed out. He goes home to that house one day, and he's drawing a glass of water from the kitchen sink and just drops dead. And he's only 54 with all these accomplishments. But now you might wonder, is that enough reason for you guys to claim dibs on Ness and put this museum here in Coudersport? I mean, he could have died passing through Ridgeway or something. He had to die somewhere. And it's not like he was born here. He wasn't born here. He was born in Chicago. But what happened in Coudersport, which makes this the right place for the Eliot Ness Museum, during that time, one of his friends, a fellow named Phelps, who he worked with in this company, a local fellow, he told Joe about his exploits with Capone in Chicago. Joe knew another guy in New York City. His name was Oscar Fraley.
A writer.
A writer. Sports writer, but really kind of a wannabe author, you know? And he said to Fraley, you need to come to Coudersport and talk to this guy Ness. There's a story here. So Fraley started coming here. And he would stay in our grand hotel next door, the Crittenden Hotel, which tragically is a whole different story, burned last year. But that's where Fraley would stay and interview Ness. They would often maybe sit in the bar or maybe go out to Mackey's Diner and talk over coffee. But the bottom line is, it was Coudersport where the story of the Untouchables was born and mostly written. Now, Ness is considered a co-author, but that's because it was his memoirs and it was his story. But Fraley wrote the book. That's why Coudersport. You and I wouldn't have met.
And the book, The Untouchables, that they produced became the basis for the famous television series starring Robert Stack.
Absolutely.
And then the great movie on The Untouchables with Sean Connery and Kevin Costner in 1997.
Exactly. In fact, thank you for that, because we are partners also with the Lucille Ball Eliot Ness Museum.
And that is in.
That's in Jamestown, New York, about 2 hours from here, and as well as the National Comedy Center, because as you point out, it was Desilu Studios who bought the rights to the book and produced the TV show, The Untouchables, in 1959.
Okay, well, let's go to the man that this is all about.
Okay.
Let's zero in on Eliot Ness, and I'd like you to sort of share. Let's start out with his youth, where he was born, what his parents and family were like. Let's start out there to talk about this evolution of one of America's greatest crime fighters ever.
Absolutely the greatest. Ness was born the son of Norwegian immigrants in Chicago. He was born in 1903, and as an interesting aside, when Ness went into the Treasury Department, he was too young, so he fudged his birth certificate. So in some cases you'll find it to say 1902. But he grew up in Chicago. He had siblings. He attended the University of Chicago, graduated from there with degrees in both political science and business, neither of which necessarily served him particularly well in other endeavors. In the 20s, he early on started, well, let me back up. Prohibition was passed in 1919. Imagine that. Overnight, one of the most popular substances in the country is all of a sudden illegal.
Alcohol.
Alcohol. Alcohol gave rise to Al Capone. Al Capone is, I still believe, one of our first and most notorious gangsters of all time, and really invented organized crime in this country, because he starts bootlegging booze on the black market. And look at that opportunity. Here's this product in universal demand that's now illegal. So Capone starts getting pretty rich. He's making money hand over fist in Chicago. Other gangs start coming up. They all want a piece of the action. The violence is getting worse. Chicagoans are getting fed up with it. So they complain to the Treasury Department, Bureau of Prohibition, the federal agency responsible for enforcing prohibition, to do something about it. So they hired Ness. And Ness hired his guys. He was very scrupulous in screening out his men. And early on, they all deservedly got the nickname the Untouchables, because Capone could not bribe Ness. Ness was incorruptible, as were his guys.
In fact, they tried to bribe him, didn't they, for $2,000? $2,000, was it a month?
Yeah,
and
which is more than, he only made like $3,000 a year.
Yeah, and he pushed, every time he was offered a bribe, he pushed the money back at them,
Yes.
refused it, and then he required that all policemen later that would be under his jurisdiction would report attempted bribes.
Exactly right. In fact, we have a little theater in the museum as well, where you'll see reenactments and portrayals of those scenes. More than just from the movie that we'll talk about too, but a play where the actor portrays both persons in the scene. And this young kid comes in with, exactly as you say, brings an envelope full of $3,000 and tries to buy, Capone had sent him, and he tries to buy Ness and he won't take it. But yes, so anyway, but this, and for other reasons that we'll get to when we talk about Cleveland and others, Ness was the perfect cop. The perfect cop. Honest, incorruptible, fair,
Hardworking.
unbiased, hardworking, relentless, humble. Perfect cop. He's a role model. That's why we celebrate Ness, his legacy, and law enforcement in this museum.
Mm-hmm. So the group that he comes up with are called the Untouchables, and what do they end up doing?
Thank you for that. You're perfect segue here. In the end, Ness and his guys brought down Capone. But it wasn't because they could get him for probably one of the countless murders he either committed or had committed. That's harder to prove. In the end, Capone was taken down for tax evasion. Now that's an IRS deal, but it's easier to get somebody when it's on paper. That's why they got Capone for tax evasion. But it was Ness and his men who made it possible to get that evidence and that data. So Ness is still largely, and his untouchables, credited for taking down Capone. So in 1931, Capone's convicted for tax evasion. And he's shipped off to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. So now he's out of the picture. It's still Prohibition. Prohibition lasted 14 years. Can you imagine? 14 years, alcohol is illegal. Ness did some other stints as a federal agent near Cincinnati, in the Appalachian region, and in Cleveland. But in 1935, the mayor of Cleveland, there was a lot of corruption in Cleveland as well. Corrupt politicians, corrupt police, the mob's rampant in Cleveland too. The mayor of Cleveland was not corrupt. And he saw what Ness had done his whole career and with Capone in Chicago. His name was Burton. If I didn't mention that, I can't remember. He hired Ness to be the public safety director for Cleveland in 1935.
And the public sector safety director was in charge of the police, the fire, and emergency medical.
Emergency services.
Emergency services, right.
Exactly right. It's a big deal job. Here's Ness in his 30s. Cleveland is a big city. I'm from near Pittsburgh. Cleveland's bigger than Pittsburgh. And you're exactly right. He had all that responsibility, the police, fire, and emergency services. And Cleveland, when he got that job, was also considered one of America's most dangerous cities. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And by the time he was done, he worked with youth to prevent juvenile crime. He reduced the youth crime rate 40% during his time.
Reduced it by 40%.
By 40%, exactly. He busted up the mob. There's a whole interesting story about, we won't have time to get to, about the Stofers and their appreciation of how he busted up the mob. By the time, Ness always also was ready to employ new and innovative law enforcement techniques and technologies. It was trademarked for him. By the time Ness was done in Cleveland, Cleveland went from being one of the most dangerous cities in America to actually being recognized as America's safest city. That's what says it all to me. That's why I say when I talk to folks who come here, Ness is most known for Chicago and Capone. But in my view, he was even more accomplished in Cleveland, but lesser known, than he was in Chicago. Now, after Cleveland, he did a lot of other things, and you know those things too. He's president of Diebold Safe and Lock, and he did a lot of other interesting things throughout his life. You'll find them all in this museum. But as I said, we already talked about Coudersport, and in 1956 he finally came here.
Okay, let's take a break at this point, and let's go take a look at some of the things in the museum and talk about Eliot Ness a little bit more.
Sure.
We'll be right back after this.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Welcome back. Steve, we're right in the middle of talking about Eliot Ness and your Eliot Ness Museum in Coudersport, Pennsylvania, up here in Potter County. In this museum that we're seated in, that you've put together over so many years, Eliot Ness's whole life and whole career is depicted here, isn't it?
Everything. His whole life from birth to death. That's why you'll find some folks come in here and They only know Ness from Chicago, and they're surprised to find things from the 50s. You'll find all these things in here. The antique cars and vehicles. We have cars like pre-1934 that represent vehicles that were on the streets when Ness was in Chicago, like the 1925 Stutz that's in the window, a luxury car for its day. We have a 1934 Pierce Arrow, another luxury car, but a car that would have been driving around on the streets when Ness was in Cleveland. And then this 1950 Hudson convertible behind me is an example of what might have been on the streets when he was here in Coudersport. That's in 1950. We also have countless stories about Ness that are obscure, that people don't know, that are fascinating and important. So you'll find those in here too. You'll find all sorts of facts and stories in law enforcement, because as I said, we celebrate law enforcement here. Ness was a role model for it. He set the example. He was also the model for the Dick Tracy comic strip, for those who might not be aware of that. And
that was originally pioneered by Chester Gould.
exactly. And one of our museum partners, Max Allen Collins, the co-author with our friend Brad Schwartz, took that comic strip over when the creator passed. And significantly, that comic strip, which was around when I was a kid, started back in those days, is really based on Ness's Cleveland years. And it exemplifies, for example, how I mentioned that Ness was always ready to embrace new and innovative law enforcement techniques and technologies. While Ness really never had a two-way wrist radio, he was really the first person responsible to deploy in a big way in a major city radio cars, radio squad cars, enormously increasing the safety of his officers. Took the beat cops off the sidewalks, enormously enhanced communications. Whereas beat cops used to have to run to a phone on a pole, now they can communicate by radio, car to car. There are lots of examples of how Ness did things like that, but you'll find a Dick Tracy, back to Dick Tracy, you'll find a Dick Tracy exhibit in here with some of those toys and one of those tin squad cars that you wind up with a key that I remember from the from the cartoon.
You also have a theater here with clips from The Untouchables and from Kevin Costner and Sean Connery's movie, The Untouchables, which was actually 1987.
Thank you for that.
1987. Yes. And that led to a revival of Eliot Ness and The Untouchables in terms of the public consciousness, because the television series was fading a little bit in public memory, but that movie really brought him back into public attention in a dramatic way, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It was a blockbuster movie by Paramount. They loaded it up with the right actors. And while I'll say Costner's no Robert Stack, he did a great job as Eliot Ness. Robert De Niro was dynamite playing Capone.
Well, and the one scene in there is actually true, so I hear. There's a scene in there, of course, Capone has a meeting of his lieutenants, and at 2 o'clock in the morning he bangs his spoon against a glass. He reaches under the table, gets a baseball bat, goes across the table and beats to death 3 of his lieutenants, finishes off the job by firing a pistol into bullets into each one 5 times.
Yes.
And that's in the movie, and that actually occurred.
That's true.
You have any mention of that here in the museum as well, under Capone?
Yeah, you'll find the trailer of the movie in the theater. Mm-hmm. And you remind me of something else important in this museum I failed to mention. We also have a St. Valentine's Day Massacre exhibit, life size.
Very famous episode in American law enforcement.
Exactly, and that's a case where, because of the mob rivalry, some of Capone's guys dressed as police officers lured some of Bugs Moran's gang into a remote Lincoln Park garage and mowed them down with shotguns and Tommy guns. And we have that exhibit right over here. We consider it kid-friendly. You can look at it to see why. But it's a kid-friendly dead gangster exhibit. But it was that event that so horrified Chicagoans that eventually led to Capone being named America's first public enemy #1. Mm-hmm.
And there were 7 mobsters, I guess, who were killed at that point.
There were 7 mobsters. You'll find that we have the exhibit laid out with only 6, because by the time a reporter got there and actually captured a photo of the scene, and you'll find the actual grisly photograph over here, with our exhibit recreating the dead gangsters in their precise positions. But there are only 6 in the exhibit. That's because by the time the reporter got there, one was still alive when the real police got there, and they had removed him to a hospital. But you're right, there were 7 killed. In the exhibit and in the actual photographs of the event, you'll only see 6.
Mm-hmm. One last thing, in the last 30 seconds, the one thing that your museum also has is considered perhaps one of the things that Eliot Ness wishes that he had been able to do. But this gentleman this individual may have been the worst serial killer in history, and that was in Cleveland, this butcher who cut up people and deposited their remains in the bad parts of Cleveland. This is, you have something about this episode in Eliot Ness's life too, that he wasn't able to solve the case, but he was able to stop it.
Exactly, and in fact, thank you for that. We have the Mad Butcher, or the Torso Killer in Cleveland. World famous case at the time, serial killer as you described. The case still has never been closed. We have extensive exhibits on that here. We have a documentary of it in the movie, and you can imagine it haunted Ness for the rest of his days, not being able to put that killer away because the killer was politically connected. But thank you for that lead, because that's a good example of how Ness employed new technologies. Because the reason Ness knew who it was, he had him in an interrogation room on a lie detector. This is the 1930s, and he's got him on a lie detector.
And the lie detector operator said that he's failed the test, but the gentleman who's being examined said, you can't submit this as evidence in court.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once the killer knew that the evidence couldn't be used against him, he taunted Ness in the very interview.
Steve, we've got to wrap this up. Thank you so much for all the information about the museum. We really appreciate it. And we ask everyone in Pennsylvania to come visit you and visit the museum and learn more about law enforcement and Eliot Ness. We'll see you next time on Behind the Headlines.